Here we go. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Joan Cartwright, and today our guest on Asalh, South Florida TV is Dr. Valerie Patterson. And Dr. Patterson teaches at Florida International University. She teaches African and African diaspora studies. And I'm just introducing her. So she's going to take it from here. I'm going to stop my screen share. And of course, we will tell everyone that Asalh is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Our national office is in Washington, D.C., and we are the South Florida branch. So, Valerie, I'll stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cartwright, for this invitation. And I'm going to start sharing my screen right now and use my slideshow. Well, actually, I need to go back. I need to play from the start. Right. So everybody, can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So again, thank you to Dr. Joan Cartwright for this wonderful invitation. And I am Valerie Patterson, clinical professor of public policy and administration at Florida International University, also the current director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program here at FIU, and a member of Asalh for several years, and most recently the South Florida branch. And so again, thank you for this amazing invitation. So I wanted to just talk about my what I call going from voted most militant, which was, I was voted most militant female in my senior class at Coral Gables High. So going from that to being director of African and African Diaspora Studies here at FIU. And this image is actually from a slide that was a part of a presentation that I did in a previous Asalh conference, and I used it to sort of ground my discussion. I used it to ground my discussion of the migration in my family from the Caribbean, and so I want to just start with a quote from Clint Smith for the New York Times. He was writing for the New York Times 1619 project. And he says, I slide my finger from Senegal to South Carolina and feel the ocean separate a million families. The soft hum of history spins on its tilted axis. A cavalcade of ghost ships wash their hands of all they carried. And so, yes, we are connected in multiple ways with the continent, and we are even connected in the diaspora. And this image, if I could take a second to briefly discuss it, is actually part of my art practice. I also do mixed media art, and this is a doll that I created with the face of Harriet Tubman, who is one of my muses in terms of my art. And I draped and dressed the doll in a kente, authentic kente fabric, and also included an image of Trayvon Martin, because his life has much significance for us here in South Florida and across the country. So yeah, so my my African American life in history in Miami. I grew up here in Miami and lived in Coconut Grove, and I like to. I thought that connecting the words of Lift Every Voice would be useful for this presentation. And because for all of us of African descent, African American descent here in the States, especially if you're in my age group, then Lift Every Voice plays a major role in your life, and especially in your education. So back to the Grove, for those of you who don't know, the Coconut Grove was settled in 1868 by Black and white homesteaders. And in terms of the, this is from a paper that I wrote, again, for an Asalh paper focused on migration. You can't tell the Grove story without telling the story of, or presenting the history and impact of Bahamians, Bahamian settlers. And most significantly for me is, I have to tell the story of Mariah Brown, who arrived in Miami by way of Key West to work at the Peacock Inn. And there's a proclamation that was issued by the city of Miami on March 16th in 2018, where March 16, 2018 was proclaimed Mariah Brown Day for the city of Miami. She was one of the first Black homeowners in the city of Miami and left a tremendous legacy. Also can't tell the story about the early Miami without mentioning the fact that Black men were registered to vote in the incorporation. You know, there was a vote to incorporate the city of Miami. And so the Flagler organization, where many of these early Bahamian men who came worked for, the organized Black men to vote in that election. And the Black men provided 162 of the 368 votes for incorporation. And what's interesting to note, and then to connect in sort of, you know, current challenges that we face in this country related to voting, is that they provided the vote that passed that allowed the incorporation to pass, and they were subsequently and almost immediately sort of disenfranchised from all that this newly incorporated city had to offer in terms of home ownership and economic prosperity, and the challenges remain. So I also, in telling the story of the Grove, which is you know, where I was born and raised, Chanel Rose actually writes about, and her book is called The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami's Civil Rights and America's Tourist Paradise, 1896 to 1968. Again, you know, starting with that incorporation, the incorporation vote. That, so Rose writes that while they were initially welcomed for their labor, right, and there was this perception, especially by those in Miami, that these Black Bahamians were docile and they were laid back. And actually what happened, according to Rose, is that many Bahamian Blacks established a culture of resistance that rejected the subjugation by openly defying white supremacy. And actually, one of the stories that I uncovered in reading Rose's text, and I was able to sort of connect to people who I knew, of Mr. Albert Gibson, for example, who refused to get American citizenship and actually was a Garveyite, is that and that many Bahamians actually refused to relinquish their British citizenship because of the ways they were treated by the white establishment in Miami, and the hostility that they found in parts of South Florida, and actually, actually protested and complained to the British government about how they were being treated. And I also thought it was like useful to include the commentary that was published in the Miami Herald in 1911 that criticized and denigrated the Negro population at that time, and argued that they were like a plague, carrying devastation with it to all surrounding property. And so again, I can't think about my history in Miami and born and raised in Miami without having this understanding and this knowledge of how Black people were treated during that time. So in starting to work on the migration paper for the Asalh conference, it was several years ago, and also most recently the Black family, I thought it was important for me, and actually for the last, I would say, 10 years, have been trying to amass and gather information on both my paternal and my maternal sides. And so now on my paternal side were my great grandmother, Anne Gaffney, presented here, whose image is here in the top. Next to her is my great grandmother, Carrie Lyles. Here is my grandmother, Teresa Asalh, and this final picture is of my father, Benny Lyles, and me as a young toddler. And so they came to my grandmother and my father migrated from South Carolina down to Miami. First, my grandmother went to Charleston, and then she ended up coming to Miami, and my father and his siblings followed her. So because of this side of my family, the images, the pictures that have been collected over the years are amazing and massive. And we started sharing these images in our South Carolina family reunions. And so I'm starting to and continue to build the knowledge and gather research on my paternal side. And then on my maternal side, where I'm really focusing most of this presentation, because it's the Miami story, right? And so I titled this slide, "Let It Resound Loud as the Rolling Sea," and looking at the 1920s and earlier. So the rolling sea figured prominently in my family's migration story as my grandmother Kiva, her sister Maud, and their mother traveled by ship to the United States from the Bahamas in 1919. And so my Uncle Wilfred actually appears on the 1920 federal census as an alien Bahamian farm labor who arrived in the United States in 1912. And so in the research that I was doing for the migration paper that I presented at Asalh, at the Asalh conference, I looked on, linked through the census documents and actually via Ancestry, and I was actually able to find the ship manifest of my great grandmother, my grandmother, and her sister, my grand aunt, actually coming by ship. They sailed from, so this side of my family, maternal side of my family, is from Harbor Island in the Bahamas. It's one of the family islands, as they say. So they went from Harbor Island to Eleuthera, from Eleuthera to New Providence and Nassau, from New Providence and Nassau, the ship sailed to Key West, and from Key West, they came to Miami. And so my grandmother, Kiva, actually died when my mother was 4, and her aunt then took on the responsibilities of rearing my mother, along with my 2 cousins here, Joe Scavella and Carnett Scavella. So they were all related. They were children of 4, 3 to, there were 4 to 5, I think it was 4 girls and one boy out of that family out of Harbor Island. And my grandmother and her 3 sisters ended up here in the States. Their brother went up to New York, but they all died. And what essentially happened was my cousins here, Joseph and Carnett, actually had to rear my mother. My mother was also assigned trustees because her grandmother left her this house, and we called it the big house in Coconut Grove because on the first floor was where all of our family lived. On the second floor was a rooming house, and so my mother, as a child, has boarders who live on the second floor of this house, and essentially, many of those people who were renting those rooms actually became more like family because everyone was there together. So for me, I attended George Washington Carver Elementary School in Coconut Grove. And so I went from the 20s to looking at the 40s and 50s, both, trying to think about my family, both maternal and paternal sides, and also the experiences that I had growing up as a child in Coconut Grove. And so we talk about the Grove, George Washington Carver Elementary School figures very prominent. It was elementary, junior high. I went to the elementary school and junior high. And then it was also a senior high. And the last class, the last graduating class at the senior high was in 1965. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But I want to take some time to talk about, to discuss and honor the memory of Father Gibson, Reverend Canon Theodore Gibson, who's shown here with his widow, Miss Thelma Gibson. So he was the father of the minister of the Christ Episcopal Church, but he also was very active in the civil rights struggle. and served as president of the Miami chapter of the NAACP from 1954 to 64. So the history of his participation, his contribution to slum abatement, to increasing civil rights, to ensuring that schools were desegregated, to impacting and influencing policy change is significant. He also, when my husband and I married in 1976, he also served as he married my husband and I in the rectory of the church. And so so Father Gibson had a sort of a significant impact on Black Miami. You know, he subsequently he at one point was a Miami City Commissioner. So on Black Miami, on the civil rights struggle, and then on my life. But I also want to mention the impact of being a student at George Washington G.W. Carver Elementary School, right? So when I started hearing about Asalh conferences and because I have a cousin up in DC who actually attends many of the Black History Month luncheons and volunteers, and started learning more and more about Asalh and felt very strongly that I wanted to be involved in participating. I thought about, you know, how growing up in Miami and attending segregated schools like Carver, how, you know, we had teachers who emphasized the importance of learning African-American history. And I remember Negro History Week, and that eventually became, you know, Black History Month, and the significance and impact of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And so that attending those schools, attending Carver, and participating in the programming that took place during Negro History Week, having teachers who were from the community. So my second and third grade teacher actually was the daughter of a Bahamian family who lived right next door to us on Washington Avenue, Miss Helena Holton. And those the teachers in my elementary school years and my junior high school years at Carver stressed the importance of learning this history and stressed the importance of reading. And so, you know, when I think of Ida B. Wells and I think of the influence and impact that she has on my art practice, it was because it all started in third grade with Miss Anderson insisting that, we read and read and read more. So this discussion of Black Miami, my Black Miami, my African-American life in Miami, couldn't be complete without thinking about if we have come over a way, thinking about the impact of immigration on myself and others who were here in the 60s. And so Marvin Dunn, who is actually a former colleague here at FIU, but also an amazing historian and who's written an impactful tome on the history of Black Miami, talked about how Miami during this time moved from a focus on securing the gains of the civil rights movement to a shift away from the concerns of Blacks in Miami in the 1960s. And so 60s, 70s major impactful years, but and depending on who you talk to about Miami, if it's my mother's generation or even in my own generation, we felt the impact of this movement away from securing the gains of the civil rights movement to a focus on immigration and newly arriving immigrants and the struggle for scarce resources, right? And the quest for a full economic parity. And I argue in thinking about that the history of my African American life here in Miami is that, you know, the quest for full economic participation actually remains. So I mentioned the 70s briefly, but the 70s, as I recall them, I thought about the 1971 riot in the Grove, and you know, that was the height of Black Power movement. That was a period where, you know, it really was this, you know, afros and the impact of the Black Panthers, and so in the 1971 riot in the Grove, I remember, because I actually lived on the main drag, which was Grand Avenue. It was very interesting. So we had moved from our family home on Washington Avenue, the big house. We moved from the big house to the little house, which was a family home that we had on Grand Avenue. That was also built by my cousin. And it was, you know, there's nothing like living on the main drag, you know, where you see everything that's happening right outside your window. And our front door had jealousies, and I could look out of the window. Our house, our porch was also adjacent to the bus stop of a major bus route, you know, so people would always be there waiting for the bus. But back to this riot, just viewing the confrontation and the conflict between law enforcement and people who were just merely walking down the street, but because of the unrest, the civil unrest that was happening at the time, ended up, you know, having to engage and interact with police officers who didn't look like them, and who are actually, the city of Coral Gables actually started right across the street from where I was. And so it just clearly, as if it were yesterday, remember sitting there on the couch in my living room and observing this Coral Gables Police Department, this officer from the Coral Gables Police Department actually stopping his car, getting out, standing on the hood of his vehicle and pointing his weapon into the face of a young Black man who was actually walking on Grand Avenue and Brooker Street in the Grove. And so, and then, you know, of course, this is a time in the country where there was lots of civil unrest. And so I also thought about the Democratic and Republican conventions that were actually held both held on Miami Beach in 1972. And being a student, high school student, and working in my local high school as an intern that summer, and having to walk through the hall of the school, and the hall that the National Guard was actually living on campus and camped there in the local high school, and my local high school was actually also inside the office, which is where I worked after my internship ended, was also a station was set up for the National Guard. So sitting there answering the calls for Coral Gables High, while across from me, maybe 20 feet away, was a National Guard officer who's answering calls for the National Guard. So it's very amazing and informative experience. But it wasn't until years later that I learned about Shirley Chisholm. And so, you know, the person who is most interested in African American history, the person who considers, you know, Shirley Chisholm, I consider her one of my muses, my art muses as well. I incorporate her life in the courses that I teach on women in administration. But the fact that she was there in Miami in 1972, Chisholm unbossed, and that, you know, I was a high school kid and didn't even know about her. I wasn't aware of her. Is, you know, now years later has had an impact, but and so I'm making up for what I didn't know in 1972 and ensuring that, you know, this next generation of students knows as much as they can about the impact and influence of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and her run for president in 1972. So the 70s took me into the 80s. I'm older now. I have a family. I have a daughter and a spouse. And again, as if it were just yesterday, the beating and death of Arthur McDuffie by Miami-Dade County police officers figures prominently in that history. And you can't tell the Miami story, you can't tell the story of Black Miami without talking about and discussing and remembering and reflecting on the Miami riots and all of the events that led to the death of Mr. Arthur McDuffie. And so I remember my grandmother calling me frantically because even though, you know, she lived in Coconut Grove, there was some unrest that happened at that in Coconut Grove as well. And you know, she called frantically saying, you know, they're rioting out here, and she just didn't know what to do. And it was like, you know, just stay in the house and you know, stay away from the doors. She also lived on Grand Avenue. At that point, I had moved to north of where I grew up, but still in Coconut Grove. So the Miami riot lasted 24 hours and an estimated 18 people were killed. I worked in the Civic Center and the murder actually occurred not too far away from there. But over $100 million in damages occurred as a result of the Miami riot. And so Dr. Dunn again has a chapter focused on the McDuffie riots. And he said that he writes that the demands after the meeting, actually there was a community meeting held, and the demands included get rid of racist cops, provide better opportunities for Blacks. So again, that quest for civil rights, the quest for economic parity, if not prosperity, remained. And And to this day, I would argue that those challenges still remain. And so some very important documentary that was produced by a young filmmaker here in Miami, and it's called When Liberty Burns, debuted maybe two years ago. And again, this is a young filmmaker who was of Haitian descent and didn't know about the McDuffie riots, but happened to find out some information and started to ask his friends, do you know about the McDuffie riots? Do you know about the Miami riots? They didn't know, and he felt compelled to start work on this documentary again, When Liberty Burns, that offers a very compelling overview of what happened, and some of the people who, you know, were there, who were work in law enforcement, who were community activists, who were community organizers, and getting their perspective and view at some years later. And from the 80s then is thinking about the 90s, and the 90s are significant for me in the sense that I was had started my doctoral program at that point, but clearly remember how excited I was when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. But my the history of Black Miami, when you talk about the 90s and you mentioned Mandela, then you have to ponder and consider the impact of the Mandela tourism boycott, right? So in July of 1990, led by attorney H.T. Smith, an economic boycott of the local tourism industry was launched and led after the Cuban American elected officials at the time snubbed South African's Nelson Mandela. And the boycott was actually called a quiet riot. And so the, you know, the kind of the history, the nuanced history of the Black community and the Cuban American community now. So it's a Black community, African American community, Haitian American community, Cuban American community, this movement to being designated a majority minority community. And when I hear that, I always say, well, but what if you're a minority in the majority minority community? That could be problematic. So I may talk about that more in a second, but the cost and impact. So the boycott had a major cost and impact. Many major organizations did not bring their conventions here. So the estimates are, in terms of lost convention business and tourism dollars, range from 20 million to $50 million. Of course, there were some changes. There were some concessions made. One of the policy gains I think that Dr. Dunn talks about is the court-ordered single-member districts resulted with that led to better representation of underrepresented groups. Also, the creation of a visitor industry council to expand African American participation in the county's tourism industry. I'm gonna go back for a second. And so, okay, so again, that the challenges remain. So my discussion of actually stopped for the first phase of this work that I had with the 90s, for one of the presentations that I used this work in. So before I sort of conclude the overview of my African American life and history in Miami, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about my other passion. So this work, being director of African and African diaspora studies, is definitely a passion of mine. And because of the legacy, the impact and influence of all of the African American teachers that I had, being a student at G.W. Carver Elementary School and junior high school, now a middle school. Just want to go back a second because there was something that I sort of skipped over, but I want to just take a minute to call your attention to this historical legacy that exists in Coconut Grove and definitely at George Washington Carver High School. So every year during Black History Month, there's a program that takes place at the middle school, right? So the high school ended in 1965, and so it's now a middle school. It's a international, so it's a magnet international school. The demography of the school is not very reflective of its surrounding community, right? Which is predominantly African American, but the school as a magnet school is not. But one of the things that takes place is that every year during Black History Month, there is this program that brings in all of the previous graduating classes of George Washington Carver when it was a high school, and also does a tremendous and important, makes a tremendous and important contribution in terms of advancing the history of Dr. Carver, his work, and also of the school itself. And so in 2020, there was a commemorative booklet published that included the previous classes. So if you see there, what you can read, it says the history of Carver beginning in 1901, and the high school graduating classes from 1939 to 1966, and then a presentation of the families of the Carverites. So each one of those classes had a name, the conquistadors, I can't think of some of the others, but had these major names, and each class is called out. And if there are, from those earlier classes, if there are still surviving members, then they're asked to stand. And for each class, the surviving or currently living members are asked to stand. And then for the last 5 years, there's a Hall of Fame inductee that is presented from previous classes. And it offers a tremendous legacy I think that between the not considering the kids who are in high school or who are in middle school, I usually am the youngest person who attends in from the adult group from previous classes. So it's usually, so I'm in my 60s. It's usually the attendees are usually in their 70s up to their late 90s who attend this event along with the kids in the middle school. And it really is major because again, the kids are learning this history that is so important. So my muses, my as I mentioned earlier, my other passion is my mixed media art. And my mixed media art is influenced very heavily by my muses, whether it be Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Barnett, and other historical Black women whose on whose shoulders we stand. So it's either I do collages or jewelry or pins or cameos or brooches. This is all a part of my art, and I just wanted to sort of take a second to show some of the images of my artwork because I've had a few exhibits at this point, and I wanted to include that work because it really is a part of the history of my African American life. And so my final slide is thinking about James Weldon Johnson's, and I started with Lift Every Voice because of the significance of that song. We had to learn it when I attended Carver Elementary School and middle school. And of course we sing it wherever we can, especially the university has a major commemorative celebration for Dr. King in January of each year that lasts an entire month. And so so I am with it's God of Our Weary Years. So in 2020, Black Miami, or my African American life, remains a tale of two cities. I have friends who left many years ago, who come to visit in the summers to see their families, and they always say, I can't believe you still live here. And I have an aunt who's also an artist, and she left in the 50s, and she said, she would never come back. She's come to visit a few times since my grandmother's death in the late 80s, but she said she would never live here again. So there are disparities, inequities, and competition for scarce resources. There's gentrification and segregated neighborhoods. But the goal is to make a difference, right? And to ensure that this next generation of students who I encounter, whether they're in my public policy and administration courses, or whether they're students who are enrolled in FIU's African and African Diaspora Studies master's program. We have several undergraduate certificates. We have two graduate certificates, and we have 4 MA to PhD pathway programs to ensure that this next generation of Black leadership is learning this history and also making a difference and making a contribution to seeing it change. So I see a hand raised.
This was so interesting, Valerie. it is to me personally because my father was born on Long Island, Bahamas.
Right.
And the history of Bahamians here is a quiet thing,
Mhm.
so this was very revealing. I want to know, we have two guests,
Mhm.
Eleanor and Roxana, and I'm so happy that they joined us. And I want to know if either or both have any questions for Valerie.
Hi, this is Eleanor, and I've enjoyed listening to Dr. Patterson and the program this afternoon because, of course, I'm fairly new to the Miami area. So for me, it is a incredible learning experience. I have not read anything similar to your presentation, and I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy this was this presentation offered insight on Miami for you. Thank you. And thank you for attending. I really appreciate it.
Yes. And so, there's Dr. Anderson, all the way from North Carolina.
Oh,
Yes.
I've been here. I
Yes.
just find it fascinating to learn so much about the history of Florida and African Americans. It's not something we talk about often. It's sort of the normal development of people in a state that seem to always have, well, every state does, but that has so much history of killing African Americans. So it was nice to hear a positive note.
I think what was so interesting, Valerie, is the pushback that we are not, going to accept being treated just any way that, you treat people, and that they complained to Britain about it. That that's almost comical at this point, because what can you say? You
Right.
know, it's. I wanted to say that at the Fountain Blue on Miami Beach, I went to a black music conference, and it was in the 80s. It could have been the late 70s, early 80s. Um, but a woman named Sharon Sofer was a filmmaker, and she had stealthily taken this film of the apartheid, the policemen shooting children in a park. I mean, we watched this in the Fountain Blue. I'll never forget this. And then I've never seen her again. And that was my introduction to what was going on in South Africa.
Mhm.
You know, I thought that, and it was in Miami, it was in Miami Beach. So the history, a lot of different histories are in a boiling pot in Miami because it's a major port to the rest of the world.
Mhm.
But this was beautiful. I really appreciate it. And my phone is ringing, and I'm just going to say text me because Valerie, uh, this is a rich addition to
Very much.
cats. Very rich. And December the 7th is my birthday, and I've been called the Jazz Warrior. I'm the Jazz Warrior, and I push back on that title, but I suppose I am for women. I thought that your presentation about Mariah Brown, who was a innovative woman, Bahamian woman, but I was also under the impression from something that I read or something that someone told me that many of the African Bahamians were escapees from Georgia and the Carolinas.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. That's, and that's something that I discovered when when I was working on the Asalh, I think it was the migration. I think it was migration paper, and I started looking at all of this history, and found out that like even during the American Revolution, that some of the Africans left the United States
Mhm.
and went to the Bahamas,
By boat,
right?
by boat.
Right, and with the Tories, right, and settled in some of the and some of the out islands. So I every day I'm learning more
Mhm.
and more about the diaspora, right, as we know it, and where these cross currents and there's so many different ways where there are cross currents, like for the people who are linguists and the Gullah, so the Gullahs, and then the Bahamians, and there's some of the language similarities and meanings for phrases, where you're not, in the Bahamas, where you're not going, that where are you going, right? And just hearing some of the Gullah language.
And skills,
Mhm.
because basket weaving,
Oh yeah, basket
basket
weaving,
weaving, you know,
yes.
hair
Outside.
braiding, hair braiding, and I, the bread, Johnny came, the bread, girl.
Oh yeah.
I ate Johnny cake when I was 12 years old. I still remember the texture and
Oh yeah.
butter on it when it comes out of that stone oven. I
Yeah.
remember that. Now, I'm older, I'm ancient, so But anyway, Roxanne, it's so good to see you. And I'll be in North Carolina in the spring, so I will hopefully we'll see each other. Valerie, I hope we get to meet. And Eleanor, as usual, I look forward to seeing you one day again.
We will see each other again. Everyone have a very happy holiday this
Everybody
week.
You
smile.
too. Happy holiday, one and all.
You too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, everybody, please, please. And thank you
Okay.
again for coming to my talk.
No, no
Thank
problem.
you.
So
You're
it'll be
welcome.
live on YouTube sometime in the next 3 days because my brain is whipped. I'm really
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Poor brain.
poor brain. So, ladies,
Bye.
this has been wonderful. This is Asalh, South Florida, and we
Signing
are
off.
a
I
nonprofit
know.
that keeps the history of African American life alive in
Alive.
South
Yeah.
Florida.
Yeah.
All right, ladies, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.